Good evening, divas. Tonight I want to introduce you to Mariah Carey, but not the Mariah you think you know. Yes, she's the woman with 5 octaves and more number one hits than the Beatles. But what if I told you that legendary voice wasn't a gift from the gods, but rather the result of the most obsessive vocal experiment in music history? Picture a young girl in Long Island, hunched over a cassette recorder at 3 a.m, playing back her own voice and taking notes like a mad scientist. That moment, that relentless pursuit of vocal perfection through pure methodology, would change music forever. We'll come back to that later, but before we begin this journey, let us know in the comments where you are listening tonight. It's always fascinating to learn where in the world you are. Please take a moment to like this video if you enjoy these personal glimpses and subscribe to the channel. It helps more than you realise. Now dim the lights, grab whatever beverage takes your fancy, and prepare to discover the true story behind Mariah Carey's secret vocal laboratory. Chapter 1. The Accidental Scientist. Our story begins not with destiny, but with necessity. In the 1970s, Huntington, Long Island, a little girl named Mariah was conducting experiments that would make Darwin proud. While other children played with dolls, Mariah was dissecting sound itself, though she didn't know it yet. The Carey household was a fascinating collision of worlds that would prove absolutely crucial to our story. Patricia Carey, Mariah's mother, wasn't just any opera singer. She was a classically trained vocalist who had performed with the New York City Opera, a woman who understood that voices weren't born fully formed. They were carefully constructed through years of disciplined practice. Patricia had spent her youth learning the rigid techniques of European classical training, understanding breath support, resonance, and the precise muscle control required to project over a full orchestra without amplification. But here's what most biographies skip over entirely. Patricia didn't just sing around the house in that casual way that musical parents often do. She turned a modest Long Island home into an inadvertent vocal laboratory where young Mariah absorbed not just melodies, but the fundamental architecture of sound production itself. Every morning, Patricia would run through her vocal exercises, scales, arpeggios, breathing techniques, and little Mariah would sit nearby, unconsciously learning the building blocks of professional vocal technique. The breakfast table conversations in the Carey household were unlike anything you'd hear in typical suburban homes. While other families discussed weather and weekend plans, the Careys debated the emotional interpretation of arias, the technical challenges of different composers, and the physics of how sound moves through space. Mariah was receiving a graduate-level education in vocal performance before she could properly tie her shoes. Alfred Roy Carey, Mariah's father, brought an entirely different but equally valuable perspective to this musical education. As an aeronautical engineer, Alfred understood the science behind how things move through air, the principles of pressure, resistance, and flow that govern everything from airplane wings to sound waves. While her mother was teaching her about breath control and resonance, her father was unknowingly explaining the physics of how voices actually work. Picture young Mariah at the dinner table, listening to her father explain how engineers design systems to move efficiently through air, while her mother demonstrated how opera singers learn to project their voices to the back of enormous concert halls. She was receiving parallel educations in the art and science of sound, though neither parent realised they were creating the perfect conditions for vocal innovation. The family's financial struggles, rather than being merely a hardship, became a crucial element in Mariah's development. The Careys couldn't afford piano lessons, voice coaching, or the kind of formal musical education that might have channeled Mariah's abilities into conventional directions. Instead, she was left to her own devices with nothing but curiosity and a cheap cassette recorder, the kind that came free with a magazine subscription or could be purchased for less than $20 at the local drugstore. While other kids her age were watching Saturday morning cartoons or playing outside, Mariah was conducting what can only be described as systematic vocal research. She would record herself singing, then play it back immediately, analysing what worked and what didn't. But this wasn't casual experimentation. Even at 8 years old, she was developing a methodical approach that would have impressed university researchers. Her parents' marriage was tumultuous, filled with the kind of arguments that send children seeking refuge in their bedrooms. The tension in the household was partly cultural. Patricia's Irish-American Catholic background clashing with Alfred's Venezuelan heritage, and partly economic, as two artistic individuals struggled to make ends meet in suburban Long Island. But rather than simply hiding from the conflict, Mariah found something remarkable. She discovered that different emotions produce completely different vocal qualities. When she was sad, listening to her parents argue through thin walls, her voice naturally became breathy and vulnerable, with a quality that seemed to reach directly into the listener's heart. When she was angry about the instability at home, her voice developed a raspy edge that added power and authenticity to more aggressive songs. When she managed to find moments of joy, usually through music itself, her voice would lift into higher registers with an almost ethereal quality. She was unconsciously cataloguing human emotion through sound, creating what would later become her signature vocal palette. Most singers learn to access different emotional qualities through acting techniques or formal training. Mariah was developing this ability organically, using her own life experiences as a laboratory for understanding how feelings translate into vocal texture. The neighbourhood kids thought she was odd, this mixed-race girl who talked to herself, made strange noises, and seemed more interested in sounds than in typical childhood activities. They had no idea they were witnessing the early stages of what would become the most technically innovative voice in popular music. While they were learning to fit in, Mariah was learning to stand out in ways that would eventually change the entire landscape of popular singing. What made this period even more remarkable was Mariah's complete isolation from formal musical education or peer influence. Without voice teachers telling her what was proper or impossible, without other young singers to compare herself to, she was developing techniques that classical instructors would have actively discouraged. She was breaking rules she didn't even know existed, creating a vocal approach that was uniquely hers because it was built from pure experimentation rather than inherited tradition. Her mother, Patricia, watched this development with a mixture of pride and bewilderment that any parent of a gifted child would recognise. Here was her daughter, essentially teaching herself advanced vocal techniques through what appeared to be organised chaos. Patricia had spent years in formal training, learning proper opera technique from established instructors, and here was Mariah, creating something entirely new through what looked like elaborate play. But Patricia was wise enough to recognise that something special was happening, even if she couldn't quite understand the process. She provided gentle guidance when asked, but mostly she gave Mariah the space to explore. This hands-off approach proved crucial. It allowed Mariah to develop her own relationship with her voice, free from the expectations and limitations that formal training might have imposed. As we'll discover, this accidental apprenticeship in vocal science, conducted in the privacy of a suburban bedroom with nothing but curiosity and a cassette recorder, would soon evolve into something much more deliberate and sophisticated. Chapter 2. The reverse engineering begins. By her early teens, Mariah had transformed from accidental scientist to deliberate researcher, and the evolution of her approach during this period is absolutely fascinating to trace. Armed with a slightly better tape recorder, a Christmas gift that might as well have been a laboratory upgrade, she began what can only be described as the most systematic vocal development program ever undertaken by a teenager. The recorder itself deserves mention here because it represented a quantum leap in Mariah's ability to analyse her own voice. This wasn't just a toy, it was a dual cassette boombox with basic recording capabilities and, crucially, a pause function that allowed her to stop and start recordings with precision. For someone conducting vocal experiments, this was like upgrading from a magnifying glass to a microscope. Here's what's absolutely fascinating about this period. Mariah didn't just listen to music the way most teenagers do, as background entertainment or emotional soundtrack. She approached every song like a forensic investigator, dissecting each element with scientific precision. She would play a Whitney Houston recording, then immediately attempt to recreate not just the melody, but the exact tonal quality, the breath placement, the emotional texture, even the subtle variations in vibrato speed and intensity. But this wasn't simple imitation. Mariah was reverse engineering the technical components that made each voice distinctive. When she studied Whitney's approach to melismatic runs, those elaborate vocal flourishes that became Whitney's signature, Mariah wasn't just trying to copy the sound. She was analysing the mathematical relationships between the notes, the precise timing of each pitch change, the way Whitney used breath support to maintain power throughout complex passages. Her musical diet during this period was bewilderingly eclectic in a way that would prove absolutely crucial to her later innovation. She studied Minnie Riperton's whistle register with the dedication of a doctoral student, spending hours trying to understand not just how to access those impossibly high notes, but how to control them, how to make them musical rather than merely impressive. She would play Minnie's "Lovin' You" dozens of times, focusing exclusively on those ethereal high notes, trying to map the physical sensations required to produce them. She analysed Aretha Franklin's runs like a mathematician examining complex equations, breaking down each ornamental passage into its component parts, understanding how Aretha used gospel-influenced vocal gymnastics to intensify emotional impact. She even created her own terminology for different types of runs. Quick ascending patterns she called stair steps, elaborate descending phrases she termed waterfalls, and complex multi-directional ornaments she simply called spirals. But perhaps most remarkably, she was studying opera recording from her mother's collection, trying to understand how classical training created such powerful resonance and projection. She would listen to Maria Callas recordings, attempting to grasp how operatic technique could be adapted for contemporary music. This wasn't about copying opera singers. It was about understanding the fundamental principles of breath support, resonance, and vocal power that could be applied to any musical style. The family's continued financial struggles meant Mariah still couldn't afford formal voice lessons, but this limitation had become her greatest advantage. Without an instructor telling her what was proper or impossible, she was free to experiment with techniques that would have made classical teachers faint with horror. She was developing her whistle register by imitating birds outside her window, creating runs that defied traditional vocal pedagogy, and learning to layer harmonies in her head before she'd ever seen a professional recording studio. Her mother, Patricia, continued to watch this development with fascination. She would occasionally offer technical advice about breath support or posture, but she was wise enough to recognise that Mariah was creating something entirely new. Patricia's classical training gave her the vocabulary to understand what Mariah was attempting, but she also recognised that formal instruction might actually limit her daughter's innovative approach. The breakthrough moment of this period came when Mariah realised she could use her voice like a multi-track recording device. She would sing a bass line melody, then add harmonies in her head, then figure out how to execute all the parts in real time. She was essentially becoming a one-person choir, years before she would have access to professional recording equipment that could layer multiple vocal tracks. But the most crucial development was Mariah's understanding of emotional authenticity through vocal technique. She realised that technical perfection without emotional truth was just showing off. Impressive, but ultimately hollow. She began experimenting with vulnerability, discovering how a slight crack in her voice could convey more heartbreak than perfect pitch, how a whispered note could be more powerful than a belted high C, how strategic imperfections could make a performance more human and relatable. This wasn't just talent development, this was the creation of an entirely new approach to popular singing that combined technical sophistication with emotional intelligence. And the most remarkable part? She was doing it all in secret, in her bedroom, with nothing but determination and recording equipment that probably cost less than most families spent on a weekend dinner out. Chapter 3. The Demo Tape Deception. Now we arrive at one of the most cunning chapters in music history, though Mariah probably didn't realise she was being cunning at the time. By the late 1980s, our bedroom scientist had evolved into something more sophisticated and slightly subversive, a vocal shapeshifter who could essentially become any singer she chose to study, and she was about to use this ability to infiltrate the music industry itself. Picture this, 18-year-old Mariah working as a coat check girl at a Manhattan restaurant called The Boiler Room, spending her meagre tips on studio time to create demo recordings. But here's the part that will make you smile. She wasn't just making demos as herself. She was creating what amounted to vocal forgeries, deliberately disguising her voice to sound like established artists, then using the industry's reaction to conduct market research on what made voices commercially appealing. The music industry in 1988 was notoriously difficult for new artists, especially young women who didn't fit neatly into existing categories. Record executives were looking for the next Whitney or the next Madonna. They wanted familiar formulas with slight variations, not genuine innovation. So Mariah, with the methodical thinking she'd inherited from her engineer father and the artistic understanding she'd absorbed from her opera singer mother, decided to conduct what amounted to an elaborate social experiment. Her first professional demo session was booked under a pseudonym. She was terrified that someone might recognise her real name from her mother's opera connections and make assumptions about her musical direction. Armed with songs she had written in her childhood bedroom, she entered a modest Manhattan recording studio with a plan that was equal parts brilliant and slightly mad. She would record each song multiple times, once in her natural voice and then in carefully constructed impressions of successful artists. The technical precision required for this deception was extraordinary. To convincingly mimic Whitney Houston, Mariah had to adjust not just her tone and phrasing, but her entire approach to breath support, her vibrato speed, even the subtle ways Whitney shaped vowel sounds. To channel Madonna's style, she had to suppress her natural melismatic tendencies and adopt a more speech-like delivery. Each impression required her to essentially rebuild her vocal technique from the ground up. The results were so convincing they were almost unsettling. When she channeled Whitney Houston's style, A&R representatives would nod approvingly and ask, "Who is this new Whitney-type artist?" When she adopted a more rock-influenced approach, mimicking artists like Pat Benatar or Heart's Ann Wilson, the same executives would declare her the next big rock vocalist. She was essentially catfishing the music industry with her voice, and it was working perfectly. But here's where Mariah's scientific approach proved invaluable. She wasn't just doing party tricks or showing off her mimicry skills. She was analysing what made each vocal style commercially appealing, then incorporating those elements into her own developing sound. She was reverse engineering the music business itself, using her voice as both the research tool and the experimental subject. She discovered that Whitney's appeal lay not just in her technical ability, but in her combination of gospel authenticity with pop accessibility. Madonna's success came from her ability to sound conversational and relatable, even while singing about complex emotions. Rock vocalists like Pat Benatar succeeded by balancing power with vulnerability, creating voices that sounded both strong and emotionally available. Each demo session became a masterclass in commercial vocal psychology. Mariah was learning not just how to sing like other artists, but why their approaches worked, what emotional buttons they pushed in listeners, and how technical choices translated into commercial appeal. She was essentially earning an advanced degree in popular music marketing, with her own voice serving as both the textbook and the laboratory. The breakthrough came when she realised something that would change everything. She didn't need to choose just one style. Her voice was capable of incorporating elements from multiple genres within a single song, even within a single phrase. This wasn't musical confusion. This was musical fusion at its most sophisticated level. Her demo of Vision of Love was the culmination of years of vocal experimentation and market research. The song showcased her whistle register, learned from studying Minnie Riperton, her melismatic runs, developed through obsessive Aretha Franklin analysis, her breath control, inherited from her mother's opera training, her emotional vulnerability, discovered through those lonely childhood recording sessions, and her pop sensibility, refined through careful study of commercial radio. It was like a thesis defense for her years of independent vocal research. But the most remarkable aspect of this demo was how it solved the categorization problem that had been plaguing the music industry. Instead of trying to fit into existing categories, Mariah had created something that transcended them entirely. Vision of Love was simultaneously R&B and pop, technically sophisticated and emotionally accessible, innovative and familiar. She had essentially created a new category of popular music. When Tommy Mottola, head of Columbia Records, first heard that demo, he famously turned his car around on the highway to find out who this singer was. What he didn't know was that he was hearing the voice of someone who had essentially earned a PhD in popular vocal performance from the university of her own bedroom, someone who understood the commercial music landscape better than most industry veterans. The executives who heard Mariah's demos couldn't categorize her, and initially that terrified them. Was she R and B, pop, soul, rock? The answer, which Mariah had discovered through years of experimentation and analysis, was beautifully simple. She was all of them, because her voice had been trained to be a perfect synthesis of American popular music itself. The irony wasn't lost on her that the same industry professionals who had been impressed by her impressions of established artists were now struggling to understand her original material. They could recognise commercial appeal when it was packaged in familiar forms, but they were less confident about innovation, even when that innovation was built on solid commercial principles. But the most remarkable part of this story is still to come, because what Mariah had created wasn't just a successful audition technique. She had accidentally invented what would become the template for modern pop vocals, and she was about to prove it in the most public way possible. Chapter 4. The studio becomes her laboratory. Here's where our story takes a fascinating turn that most people never hear about, and it reveals just how methodical Mariah's approach to vocal innovation really was. When she finally got a record deal with Columbia Records in 1990, she didn't just enter the studio as a singer looking to capture her voice on tape. She arrived as a vocal architect with very specific ideas about how voices should be constructed in recorded music, ideas that would fundamentally change how pop records were made. The year was 1990, and multi-track recording technology was becoming more sophisticated, but most artists still approached vocals in a fairly traditional way. Record the lead vocal, maybe add some harmonies, perhaps double-track the chorus for emphasis, and call it finished. This approach had worked for decades, from the early days of Motown through the pop explosion of the 1980s. Mariah had entirely different plans. Walter Afanasieff, her producer and collaborator, later described those early sessions as unlike anything he'd experienced in his career. Most singers would arrive at the studio, warm up briefly, record their lead vocal in a few takes, add a harmony or two if the song called for it, and consider the vocal work complete. The focus was typically on capturing a good performance rather than constructing something entirely new. Mariah would arrive with what Walter called vocal blueprints, detailed plans for how she wanted to construct walls of sound using only her own voice. These weren't simple lead sheets or lyric charts. They were architectural drawings for vocal arrangements that had never been attempted before, showing how multiple layers of her voice would interact to create harmonic and rhythmic effects that no single vocalist could achieve. But here's the truly remarkable part. She wasn't just stacking vocals randomly, the way some artists might double track a chorus or add a few harmonies for thickness. She was applying acoustic principles she'd learned through years of experimentation, principles that most professional engineers didn't fully understand. She knew that certain frequencies would complement each other while others would create muddy interference. She understood that specific intervals would create emotional responses in listeners, and that the placement of breath sounds could add intimacy or power depending on their context. Her approach to the whistle register alone was revolutionary and deserves detailed examination. Most singers who could access those impossibly high notes, and there were very few of them, used whistle tones as occasional flourishes, vocal fireworks to show off their range at climactic moments. Think of Minnie Riperton's famous moment in Lovin' You. Beautiful, impressive, but essentially decorative. Mariah had figured out how to use whistle tones as integral parts of the song's harmonic structure. She wasn't treating her highest notes as special effects, but as legitimate musical instruments that could carry melody, provide harmonic support, or create textural contrast. She could weave whistle register lines through the fabric of a song so seamlessly that listeners might not even consciously notice them, but they would feel their emotional impact. The recording of Vision of Love became a masterclass in vocal layering that other artists and producers would study for decades. Mariah didn't just sing the lead melody, she created an entire choir of herself, with each vocal line serving a specific architectural purpose. There were foundation vocals that provided harmonic support, like the bass section of a traditional choir. There were decorative runs that added emotional texture without overwhelming the main melody. There were whistle register accents that created moments of transcendence, lifting the entire arrangement into higher emotional territory. But the most sophisticated element was her understanding of vocal rhythm and timing. She had learned to create polyrhythmic effects using only her voice, layering vocal parts that emphasized different beats and created complex rhythmic textures. This wasn't just about harmony, it was about using the human voice as a percussion instrument, a concept that wouldn't become common in popular music for several more years. What made this even more impressive was Mariah's intuitive understanding of space within a recording. She had learned through all those years of bedroom experimentation that silence could be as powerful as sound. She knew exactly when to pull back, when to let a single voice carry the emotion, and when to unleash the full power of her vocal orchestra. This dynamic range, from whispered intimacy to soaring power, became one of her most distinctive characteristics. The technical crew at the recording sessions were initially skeptical. Here was this young woman, barely 20 years old, telling experienced engineers how she wanted her vocals recorded and mixed. But as the sessions progressed, they began to realise they were witnessing something unprecedented. Mariah wasn't just singing, she was composing in real time, creating vocal arrangements that pushed the boundaries of what recording technology could capture. Her perfectionism during this period was legendary, but it wasn't the destructive kind of perfectionism that some artists develop. It was the focused precision of a scientist conducting crucial experiments. She would record the same vocal line dozens of times, not because she was dissatisfied with her performance, but because she was exploring subtle variations in tone, timing, and emotional approach. Each take was a data point in her ongoing research into vocal possibilities. The industry took notice immediately, but they misunderstood what they were hearing. They thought Mariah was simply a technically gifted singer with impressive range who happened to have good instincts about vocal arrangements. They didn't realise she was actually a vocal innovator who was redefining how popular music could be constructed. She wasn't just singing songs, she was creating new possibilities for what recorded vocals could accomplish. The secret that the industry didn't fully grasp was that Mariah had essentially created a new instrument, not just her voice, but a systematic approach to using recording technology to expand vocal possibilities. She was thinking like a composer, an arranger, a sound engineer, and a vocalist all at once, roles that were traditionally separate in the music making process. And this was just the beginning, because what Mariah would do next would influence not just her own career, but the entire trajectory of popular music for decades to come. Chapter 5. The Butterfly Effect. How one voice changed everything. Mariah Carey didn't just become successful through her innovative vocal techniques. She accidentally created the template that virtually every pop vocalist would follow for the next 3 decades, fundamentally altering the DNA of popular singing itself. Here's the surprising truth that requires us to completely reconsider the landscape of contemporary music. The melismatic vocal runs that define modern R&B and pop, those elaborate vocal gymnastics that artists from Beyoncé to Ariana Grande are famous for, can be traced directly back to Mariah's bedroom experiments in the 1980s. But the influence goes far deeper than just ornamental vocal flourishes. When Vision of Love was released in 1990, it didn't just introduce a new artist, it introduced a completely new vocabulary for popular singing. The song demonstrated possibilities that most professional vocalists didn't even know existed. Mariah's approach to combining operatic technique with hip-hop sensibility, gospel emotion with pop accessibility, classical precision with contemporary spontaneity, created a blueprint that would reshape the entire industry. The fascinating part is that this influence wasn't intentional or strategic. Mariah wasn't trying to start a revolution, she was simply solving problems that existed in her own musical imagination. She wanted to create vocals that could carry complex emotions while showcasing technical ability. She wanted to bridge the gap between the diverse musical influences she'd absorbed in her multicultural household and the sounds that dominated commercial radio. She was essentially trying to create music that sounded like her own identity, complex, layered, and impossible to categorize neatly. The breakthrough moment came with Emotions in 1991, a song that pushed her vocal innovations even further than Vision of Love. The vocal arrangement on that track was so technically complex and emotionally sophisticated that it essentially announced a new era in popular music. The whistle register runs weren't just impressive, they were integral to the song's emotional impact. The layered harmonies weren't just decorative, they created a sonic landscape that supported and amplified the song's joyful energy. But here's what makes the story even more remarkable. Other artists began studying Mariah's recordings like textbooks, trying to understand how she achieved these effects. Young singers would slow down her songs, attempting to transcribe the exact notes and rhythms of her most complex runs. Voice teachers started incorporating her techniques into their curricula, despite having no formal training in how to teach them. The whistle register, which had been considered a rare novelty before Mariah, suddenly became a legitimate part of contemporary vocal training. Singing schools began advertising their ability to teach Mariah-style runs. The entire approach to vocal education started shifting from traditional classical or musical theatre techniques toward the kind of contemporary R&B and pop styling that Mariah had pioneered. Christina Aguilera, who emerged in the late 1990s, was one of the first major artists to openly acknowledge Mariah's influence on her vocal approach. But Christina's interpretation of Mariah's techniques was just the beginning. Beyoncé's vocal style, with its combination of power and agility, its seamless movement between chest voice and head voice, its use of melismatic runs as emotional punctuation, bears clear traces of Mariah's innovations. Alicia Keys, who burst onto the scene in the early 2000s, combined Mariah's vocal approach with her own classical piano training, creating yet another variation on the template. Even artists who seemed to work in completely different genres, like Ariana Grande, who initially emerged from the world of musical theatre and teen pop, eventually adopted vocal techniques that could be traced directly back to Mariah's bedroom experiment. But the influence extended beyond just vocal technique to the entire approach to recorded music. Mariah's method of layering multiple vocal tracks to create complex harmonic textures became standard practice in pop production. Her use of vocal arrangements as compositional elements, rather than just performance elements, changed how producers and arrangers thought about the role of vocals in popular music. The polyrhythmic vocal techniques she developed, using different vocal parts to emphasize different beats and create complex rhythmic textures, became fundamental to the sound of contemporary R&B and hip-hop. Artists like Lauryn Hill, who combined rap and singing in sophisticated ways, were building on foundations that Mariah had established years earlier. Even the emotional approach to vocal performance shifted in response to Mariah's innovations. Her demonstration that technical virtuosity could coexist with genuine vulnerability, that impressive vocal gymnastics could serve emotional rather than just exhibitionist purposes, gave other artists permission to be both technically ambitious and emotionally authentic. Here's what makes this story even more remarkable. Mariah achieved this massive influence while facing significant industry skepticism about her racial identity and musical authenticity. The same executives who were profiting from her innovations were simultaneously questioning whether she was really R&B or really pop, as if her mixed heritage made her musical contributions somehow less valid or authentic. This tension actually pushed Mariah to become even more innovative. When critics suggested she was too pop for R&B audiences or too R&B for pop radio, she responded by creating music that transcended both categories entirely. Albums like Music Box and Daydream proved that artistic authenticity couldn't be reduced to simple demographic categories. It had to be earned through innovation, emotional truth, and musical excellence. The secret architecture of Mariah's voice wasn't just about vocal technique. It was about creating a new way for popular music to embrace complexity, both technical and emotional, and that embrace would reshape the entire landscape of contemporary music. Chapter 6. The Laboratory Legacy. Tonight, as you prepare for sleep, consider this beautiful truth. Every time you hear a contemporary artist execute a complex vocal run, layer harmonies in unexpected ways, or seamlessly blend genres within a single song, you're hearing the echo of those late-night sessions in a Long Island bedroom where a young girl was methodically teaching herself to become a human orchestra. But Mariah's legacy extends far beyond just vocal technique. Her story represents something profound about the nature of innovation itself. How genuine breakthroughs often come not from institutions or established experts, but from curious individuals who approach familiar problems with completely fresh perspectives. She didn't set out to revolutionize popular music. She simply wanted to solve the puzzle of how to make her voice accurately represent the complexity of her musical imagination and personal identity. The techniques she developed through pure experimentation, the architectural approach to vocal layering, the integration of classical training with contemporary sensibility, the use of vulnerability as a technical tool rather than a limitation, have become so fundamental to modern pop music that we barely notice them anymore. They're simply part of the language that contemporary artists speak, as basic to current vocal technique as scales and arpeggios are to classical training. Walk into any recording studio today and you'll find artists using approaches that Mariah pioneered in her bedroom 35 years ago. The multi-track vocal arrangements that seemed so revolutionary in 1990 are now standard practice. The seamless blending of genres that once confused record executives is now the norm rather than the exception. The emotional authenticity combined with technical sophistication that once seemed impossible to achieve simultaneously is now what audiences expect from professional vocalists. But perhaps the most inspiring aspect of Mariah's story is how it demonstrates the power of embracing rather than hiding your complexity. In a world that often demands simple categories and easy explanations, Mariah created art that celebrated the beauty of not fitting into neat boxes. Her voice became a bridge between worlds, classical and contemporary, R&B and pop, technical precision and emotional authenticity, different cultures and musical traditions. The young girl who felt isolated because of her mixed heritage grew up to create music that made millions of people feel less alone in their own complexity. The teenager who was told her voice was too different for the music industry became the artist who expanded what the industry considered possible. The woman who was criticised for being too much, too technical, too emotional, too ambitious, proved that sometimes too much is exactly what the world needs. As you settle into sleep tonight, remember that Mariah's greatest innovation wasn't ultimately technical. It was the courage to trust that her authentic voice, in all its complexity and contradiction, was worth sharing with the world. She proved that the things that make us different aren't obstacles to overcome, but gifts to cultivate and celebrate. Her story reminds us that true artistry comes not from following established paths, but from having the courage to create new ones. The secret architecture of Mariah Carey's voice was ultimately about building bridges between genres, between communities, between the technical and the emotional, between what was and what could be. In doing so, she didn't just create beautiful music, she created new possibilities for human expression itself. The laboratory she built in her childhood bedroom became a template for artistic innovation that extends far beyond music. It shows us that curiosity, persistence, and the willingness to experiment can lead to discoveries that change entire fields of human endeavour. Her legacy lives on not just in the voices of contemporary artists, but in the broader understanding that innovation comes from embracing complexity rather than avoiding it. As our journey through Mariah Carey's secret vocal laboratory concludes tonight, we're reminded that the most profound innovations often begin in the most ordinary places. A teenager's bedroom, a cheap cassette recorder, and the simple desire to understand how beautiful sounds are made and how they can carry the full complexity of human experience. Mariah's story teaches us that genius isn't always born fully formed. Sometimes it's methodically constructed, one experiment at a time, by individuals brave enough to trust their own curiosity over conventional wisdom. Her voice didn't just entertain us, it expanded our understanding of what human expression could accomplish when freed from artificial limitations and encouraged to explore its full potential. Until our next diva story, this is The Sleeping Gay, encouraging you to remain curious about the incredible stories still waiting to be told, and to remember that your own unique voice, whatever form it takes, might just be exactly what the world needs to hear. Sweet dreams, fellow dreamers, and may your rest be filled with wonder at the beautiful complexity that surrounds us all. Good night.